Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Welcome to part 3 of this series, Top 10 Microstakes Leaks. Working our way down from number 10, we've reached Microstakes Leak number 4, Leveling. Firstly, let's answer the question, what exactly are levels? Each of the players at the table are usually playing on a number of one of a few different levels. The first level is level 0. These players are just clicking buttons. They don't necessarily understand how to play. Maybe some of them are slightly better than this, but they are likely to be huge calling stations, or maybe they're running huge bluffs in spots where it just doesn't make any sense. The next level up, level 1, are players who are following a very basic strategy. They are betting their good hands for value. They are folding their weak hands. They are not running any crazy bluffs. They are just playing good, straightforward, level 1 poker. The next level up, we have players who are playing on level 2, and these players are beginning to mix things up a bit. They understand how the level 1 player is playing. They understand the level 1 player is just betting his good hands for value and he's giving up on his weak hands. The player who is on level 2, he recognizes these level 1 players and he is taking advantage of how the level 1 players play. He knows that anytime a level 1 player is aggressive, he can safely fold because this level 1 player has a strong hand. And he knows when the level 1 player is playing passively, there's a good chance he does actually have a weak hand, and the player on level 2 can proceed to steal the pot from the level 1 player, regardless of whether he actually has a hand. Ideally, the level 2 player can also recognize the level 0 players, and the way he is going to beat the level 0 players is just by playing a very basic level 1 strategy. So although he is capable of thinking on level 2 and using this to his advantage against the level 1 players, when he's playing a huge donk on level 0, he is going to want to adjust to a level 1 strategy. And we'll talk a little bit why in the next slide when we discuss leveling ourselves, which is the main leak that players have at the microstakes. Finally, we'll consider one last level, and this is level 3. These players don't really come about that often at the microstakes, and the level 3 player, he understands how the level 2 player is thinking and he's able to exploit the level 2 player. For example, perhaps the level 2 player, he is 3-betting light against the level 1 player because he knows the level 1 player is responding very tightly to 3-bets. Perhaps the level 3 player picks up on this and he is waiting there to throw in a cold 4-bet bluff. The reason why there aren't many level 3 players at the micros is because there aren't a lot of level 2 players, and a lot of the time trying to think on an advanced level, i.e. trying to play level 3, is going to result in you making some big mistakes. So this is basically the process of leveling, and it's selecting an appropriate level to play against your opponent. As said, if our opponent is not really aware of good strategy, we just want to play on level 1 against that opponent, play a very basic strategy, bet our good hands for value and fold our weak hands. We may then recognize some slightly better players at the micros who understand which hands are good hands and are playing a very straightforward level 1 strategy, and we can begin to start playing on level 2 against his opponents. Maybe we can find some good spots to throw in double barrels if we think our opponent's weak, or maybe we can find some good spots to 3-bet bluff pre-flop. The key is that if we were to take a level 2 approach against a level 0 player, we are going to end up running into trouble. Because, as discussed, just because the level 0 player is betting big doesn't necessarily mean he has a strong hand, as in the case of the level 1 player. And again, just because the level 0 player is playing passively, that doesn't necessarily mean he's weak. Perhaps he is trying to slow play his hand, etc. Or perhaps he doesn't even understand he has a strong hand if he is a really bad player. So the process of leveling really involves thinking on the correct level. The problem is a phrase known as leveling yourself, and that's when basically you're trying to think on to an advanced level, and as a result you end up making a very bad decision. For example, let's imagine we are in a situation where our opponent has fired 3 streets, so he's bet big on the flop, the turn and the river. Let's imagine this player is one of the level 1 players, and we know that he's very likely to have a hand when he bets 3 streets. In fact, there's a very small chance that he's bluffing. Rather than make the correct fold, we could begin to level ourselves, and that is, perhaps we could start to think on level 3 here and think to ourselves, well, perhaps our opponent realizes that we don't expect him to ever be bluffing here when he fires 3 streets, because he hasn't been firing 3 streets as a bluff. He's always shown up with a value hand, so perhaps he's now using that, knowing that we know he's never bluffing, and firing 3 streets as a stone cold bluff. In fact, I think he's definitely bluffing. I call. This is an example of leveling yourself. It's very unlikely that the proposed scenario really did happen. If your opponent hasn't been 3-barreling as a bluff, he probably hasn't suddenly adjusted now. He probably has a strong value hand, and the correct option is to fold. So we can see that thinking on the wrong level, or to use the phrase leveling yourself, can cause you to make the exact opposite of the correct play. In this case, our opponent quite clearly has a strong value hand, but we start to give our opponent credit for making an advanced play where he's using his own image to bluff in a spot where you don't ever expect him to be bluffing. And while this is a characteristic of very advanced players, it's not something that your average microstakes player is going to do. And if you're going to end up giving your opponents credit for thinking on these advanced levels, you're going to make a lot of incorrect decisions in the long run. So the key thing to take away from this particular leak is, don't give people credit for thinking on an advanced level at the micros. So just because a certain spot, for example, is a very good spot to bluff because your opponent is representing strong value, don't expect your opponent to understand that it's a good spot to bluff. The chances are, if your opponent is representing a strong value hand, he likely has a strong value hand. Of course, all opponents are different, and the idea of categorizing each of our opponents into a specific level has certain limitations, in that while we expect your average opponent at the microstakes to not run big 3-barrel bluffs, for example, it is the case that some opponents are very bluffy and will try to do this. So it is really completely villain dependent. Also, if your opponent has a history of bluffing, it makes it, of course, more likely that he's going to be bluffing in a certain spot. In general, though, the way to beat the microstakes is to think on level 1. You should only really be playing on a higher level than level 1 after you pick up solid reads, or at least a decent amount of statistics on your opponent. For example, if you have a HUD running and you see that some opponents on your table have quite tight aggressive looking stats, maybe something like 1815 or maybe 2017, there's a good chance that these players are level 1 players, whereas if you see that they have a VPIP of 60 plus, there's a good chance that they are going to be a level 0 player. Perhaps they are totally clueless about good strategy, or perhaps even if they do have a clue about basic strategy, they are likely to be huge calling stations, or they are going to be running big bluffs. And against these players, the way you defeat these players is by playing on level 1. so playing a very straightforward, tight aggressive strategy against the aforementioned taggy looking players. The way you defeat these players is by playing on a slightly more advanced level, thinking on level 2. As said, it's unlikely you're going to need to think on a higher level than this. You may find yourself leveling yourself and losing a lot of money as a result. So don't give people credit for thinking on an advanced level of the micros. Leveling just doesn't really happen at the micros. It is a big part of poker, but it really applies much more at the small stakes and above. Okay, so that brings us on to our next microstakes leak. Microstakes leak number 3, ignoring resources. So which resources are we talking about? There are many players at the microstakes who they go through their poker experience purely logging into their favourite poker client. Of course, enjoying playing the games, but never really thinking about different ways they can actively improve their skill at the game of poker. The resources available are as follows. Firstly, forums. Forums are an excellent place for you to pick up strategy advice. One thing you can do on various forums is you can post some of the hands you've played, and players will give you their analysis of what they think about the hand you played, how they would have played it themselves, etc. And you can get into some discussions with these players. Of course, you shouldn't necessarily trust everything you read on the forums. There are plenty of bad players who want to post their analysis of your hand also, but so long as you can take everything with a pinch of salt and you can try and extract the good things from what players have said about your hand on the forums, then it can be a very useful tool for improving your game. And at least, even if you don't necessarily agree with what some of the other players are posting, it gives you an idea about how other players think, and understanding how other players think is going to be very useful for you in terms of finding the best play when you're at the table, because perhaps you have a better idea about your opponent's range and tendencies just because you have a stronger idea about how the average opponent thinks. There are, of course, many other things you can discuss in the forums as well. You can discuss things like the latest poker-related news, what's happening in the world of tournament poker, live poker. Also, there are often sections of a forum dedicated to people discussing bad beats and downswings, which you may sometimes find inspiring if you're on a bad run, just to see that however bad you think that you are running, there's likely someone out there who has an even worse graph than you, who's been losing over tens of thousands of hands, etc. Or perhaps that person is running hugely under EV, perhaps even they're running 100 buy-ins under EV. There are such graphs out there on the forums. So if you think you're running bad, sometimes it can be inspiring to visit the bad beat threads on various forums. One thing you can do is you can also arrange sweat sessions and meet up with other players. For those of you that don't know, a sweat session is an opportunity to have someone watch your play, and in turn you watch their play, and you can make comments on how you think each other played and what you do differently. There's various software you can use to do this. One software is called TeamViewer, which is free to download, and it allows you to see each other's screen. Of course, you should always be very careful about who you allow to look at your whole cards, because there are people out there who will try and cheat you, and they will sit down on your table and use your whole card information about you. But so long as it's someone you can trust, then it can be a very good opportunity to allow them to watch you play and vice versa. Of course, sweat sessions don't have to be over TeamViewer, or Mikogo is the other software. So TeamViewer or Mikogo, both screen sharing software. Of course, it doesn't have to be over the internet. If you know other poker players in real life, of course, it can be very good if you get them to watch your play and make comments, and then you can do the same for them, and you can both learn in this way. That brings us on to our next resource. You meet these players on the forums, then what you'll find is that there's usually opportunities to become part of a study group. And this is usually a slightly smaller group, often 5 or 6 people. There are some larger study groups out there, sometimes with 30 or more people in them. Usually these study groups take place via some type of chat software. Very often it seems to be on Skype. A lot of poker players seem to make use of Skype these days. And you can usually find invitations to these groups via the forums, and then you can discuss with the other players in the group various strategy, etc. You can post some of your hands to each other for evaluation. And sometimes this can be more useful than posting on the forums, because you get to know the various people in your group, and you can maybe make some judgments about what kind of level you think they're playing on and how they think about the game. Therefore, you can analyze whether their advice is useful or not. Whereas just reading some random poster on the forums, you don't necessarily know if their advice about your hand is useful or it's not useful. In study groups, a lot of the time the players are a lot more focused and interested in working on their own game also. And it definitely can be a very useful resource. Another very useful resource is training sites. These are sites with articles on poker strategy and also training videos on poker strategy, and often a number of other resources, things like starting hands, charts, EV calculators, etc. PokerVIP.com is one example of such a site. The fact that you are watching this video means that you are at least vaguely aware of some of the resources out there. Of course, there are plenty of other training sites out there which you can find quite easily by running some searches or talking to people about them on the forums. I won't necessarily mention them in this video, but they are out there. So if you find yourself having watched all the videos on PokerVIP.com and read all the articles here, then you can think about looking at other sites, etc. Again, along the same kind of line, you can read books, and you can also read these books in PDF format. You can usually find these available online somewhere. Some players simply prefer reading books to watching videos and reading online articles, and it's definitely a recommended way of improving your game. Of course, books have the added advantage that you can carry them around with you, which you can't necessarily carry your laptop or your computer around with you, although of course people do have tablets these days where they can take books around with them in PDF format. But in general, books are going to be a lot more portable than your computer, so they are good things to have with you if you are going on holiday, etc. And there are definitely some very good books out there for improving your game. The last resource, and definitely a very important resource, is using some of the available software out there to help you analyze and improve your game. The two main types of software players use are the tracking softwares, Holder Manager or Poker Tracker. Holder Manager 2 is now out, and Poker Tracker 4 is now out, the latest versions of both of these two pieces of software. If you don't know, and it's definitely recommended if you don't already use one of these two pieces of software, that you go and download the free trial. They both offer at least a 30-day free trial for you to try out the software. It is commercial software. It does cost money if you want to have the software. However, there are certain deals you can find where you are able to get the software for free if you search around. It will usually involve signing up to a particular site and playing a certain amount of raked hands. But if you do this, it is possible to get the software without actually having to pay for it, and there are various discounts you can find for the software around about on the forums. Anyway, what this software does is it tracks your played hands, it puts them in a graph for you. You can then run various filters on all the hands you've played. So let's say, for example, you think that you are losing money in 3-bet pots. You can run a filter for 3-bet pots, and you can look at all the hands which were 3-bet, and you can work out where exactly you are losing money. You then might narrow the filter slightly. You might find that most of your losses are coming from suited connectors in 3-bet pots, so you could maybe add another filter, and you may find out that you're making a certain play which is not going to be profitable in the long run. Another very useful feature of these two pieces of software is they allow you to load up what's known as a heads-up display, or HUD, over your tables, which displays various statistics about your opponents on the table. In particular, how many hands they play, how many hands they open raise, how many hands they 3-bet, etc. How aggressive are they, how often do they continuation bet. This can be very useful, especially if you like to play multiple tables. It allows you to keep a better track of the various player types on your table. If you're just one tabling, you might be aware that a particular player is c-betting very frequently, or he is playing a lot of hands, or he's 3-betting a lot. But if you're playing maybe 4 or more tables, you might not necessarily notice a particular player on your table is doing a certain thing. Whereas if you have it notated there for you on the table via your HUD, you may not have even seen a player play a single hand, yet you may have a vague idea of how he plays just from the statistics that your software has accumulated on him. These aren't just the only two pieces of software. There are other things such as PokerStove, for one example, which is an equity calculator. What this allows you to do is to input your hand, input your opponent's hand, and then calculate how much equity one hand has against the other hand. But then more than this, rather than just inputting a specific hand, you can give your opponent a range of hands and then calculate your equity against your opponent's range of hands. This is really useful for looking back over hands you've played and working out whether you had the pot odds to call in certain situations after you input your hand, the flop, and your opponent's range, etc. Then, of course, there are other pieces of software like Flopzilla, which helps you calculate how hard certain boards hit your opponent's range. There are other things like EV calculators, which are built in to certain websites, and this is useful if you are interested in the maths behind calculating your expected value. And finally, there are things that help you calculate your possibility of going broke given a certain bankroll, playing certain limits, and given a certain standard deviation which you can find using Holder Manager, Poker Tracker, etc. And you can calculate a percentage chance that you will go broke. And this is useful for thinking about what type of bankroll management you want to use. So just to summarize, the leak here is ignoring the tons of available resources out there which can be used to improve your game. There's a reason why players are always talking about how the games have become tougher in recent years, and that's because of the ready availability of all these materials which players are using. So if you're not using these materials yourself, you're going to be at a disadvantage. The goal here is to make better use of these resources than your opponents, and you should still continue to have an edge in the long run. Okay, so MicroStakes leak number 2, table selection. Why table select, and what exactly is table selection? Table selection very simply is looking for the best tables to play on, rather than just immediately sitting down anywhere where there's an empty seat. you're looking for a certain feature of the tables, more often than not that the table has a decent amount of weaker players or fish. So why table select? Your win rate is heavily dependent on the softness of the tables you join. Perhaps you've heard this adage: it doesn't matter if you are the 10th best player in the world if you are sitting with the top 9. So you might be an expert poker player, you might be one of the best in the world, but if you are sitting with the top 9, then you are actually going to be a losing player at that table. You shouldn't necessarily expect to be a winner in the long run, because every single player at that table is better than you. The same really applies to the micro stakes. You may be a very strong player, but your edge is going to be a lot bigger over the fish than it is going to be over the micro stakes regulars who are sitting there and grinding the micro stakes for hours every day. You may even find that 1 or 2 players at the micro stakes have an edge over you, that they are slightly better. So why would you want to sit down at a micro stakes table where there are maybe 1 or 2 players that are potentially better than you, when you can sit at a table which is full of fish and you expect to have a very high win rate? And I see it all the time, even at the micro stakes on various sites, because I mark the players who I perceive to be regulars, and a lot of the time I see 4 or 5 of these regulars sitting at a micro stakes table. It's mainly a coincidence. Most of the tables are only going to have maybe 2 or 3 regulars on, but every so often I see 1 or 2 tables at the micro stakes which are absolutely crammed with the regulars, and it makes me wonder, are these regulars even thinking about table selection at all? And there's 2 answers to this. I think the most likely answer is that they are not thinking about table selection, and by not thinking about table selection they are affecting their win rate. And the other answer is that they are thinking about table selection, but they like playing against tougher opponents because it makes the game more exciting for them. Either is possible, but assuming our goal here is to maximize our win rate and not to have the most fun at the table, then it makes sense to try and avoid the tables which have a lot of regulars on them. You will hear people say that there are no regulars at the micro stakes. This is not true. There are regulars at the micro stakes. There are some players at the micro stakes who are not even that bad. Sometimes good players come down from the small stakes or even higher just for a bit of fun on the micro stakes tables. Sometimes you find players like me sitting at the micro stakes table making coaching videos, etc. Just because you are at the micro stakes doesn't necessarily mean everyone's bad. It just means that the average player you select at the micro stakes is likely to not be a very strong player. So you still want to think about maximizing your win rate by selecting tables with the highest expectation in terms of having fish. So just to go over what makes a good table, recognizing good tables. Firstly, you want weaker players, you want as many fish as possible, but it's helpful if you can be in position on the weaker players. It's also useful to understand that if you are playing at a table and every other player on the table is playing with a high VPIP or voluntarily put in pot, i.e. they're playing a huge amount of hands, you can find that these tables become very high variance. It may actually be the case that you prefer playing on tables with position on 1 or 2 fish, and then the other players at the table are a little bit tighter, because on these particular tables, although your expected value won't be as high as a table absolutely full of fish, you may find that the variance is a little bit lower and it's a little bit less stressful when you end up losing huge amounts just as a result of variance. But the key principle is you want to be in position on weaker players. It's still good if there is a huge fish in position on you, but it's a lot better if you are in position on the weaker players. So you want to be to their immediate left. Possibly it's good that the players with position on you are weak tight. This means that you can steal their blinds a lot. It also means that they aren't going to be playing back at you. For example, if you open raise from the cutoff, you don't want the player on the button to be 3-betting you a ton or flattening you in position a ton and making plays post-flop. It's going to be very difficult for you to make this profitable, especially against very aggressive opponents. So it's really ideal if the players in position on you are going to be folding a lot, while the players that you have position on are going to be calling a lot, so you can play a lot of pots in position. You might want to think about avoiding tables with short stacks also, and this is somewhat a preference thing. Some players don't mind playing against short stacks. You really just need to be aware of how your strategy is affected by the presence of short stacks on the table. If in general you're going to be playing a very tight strategy, it's not necessarily so much of a big issue that there are short stacks on the table. If you're looking to open up and widen out your opening range, then it can be difficult with short stacks, especially short stacks in position on you, who can think about possibly 3-betting light, and you find yourselves in a lot of tricky spots where maybe your opponent who's short stacked shoved and you have an average hand. Against a full stack it would be an easy fold, but against a short stacker it becomes a lot closer with all the money that's already in the pot, whether you should make the call, etc. You can put yourself into some awkward situations, and as a result it becomes not necessarily that profitable to open wide when there are short stacks in position on you. So if you're looking to play a slightly looser strategy, it can be useful if there aren't too many short stacks at the table, or if there are short stacks at the table, you have position on them, so you can see what they are going to do before you decide whether you want to get involved in the hand, rather than you open raising and just being relentlessly 3-bet by one of the short stacks who has position on you. So it is somewhat of a preference thing. Personally, I prefer to play against players with deeper stacks. There's more skill involved and you should have a larger edge against deeper stacks than you do against short stacks. And finally, as said, you don't really want strong aggressive players in position on you, especially if they're going to be doing things like 3-betting a lot. If you find yourself at such a table, sometimes the best option is literally just going to be to leave the table and find a better table where you aren't going to be played back at so much. It's different at the mid-stakes and the high-stakes games, where the dynamic of the tables is such that if you're on a 6-max table, 4 of the players are going to be strong regulars, and then maybe one of the players is going to be a regular but maybe slightly weaker than the other regulars. So you have to really take what's given to you. At the micro-stakes this is not the case. There's nearly always going to be a better table where you can have position on the fish and not have strong aggressive players with position on you. So at the micro stakes there's not really any excuse for playing at a table full of strong players, unless for some reason you just want to play against stronger opponents. Some of the tools we can use to help us in table selection. One is the integrated marking system, which is present in most poker software. Usually it allows you to assign a colour to the players on the tables, and this can be useful to mark the fish a certain colour, mark the regulars another colour, maybe mark the short stackers another colour, etc. And if there are any huge fish who are just spewing money all over the place, maybe you can pick even another colour for these and make these your prime target. You definitely want to join these tables if you see them. So the next time you log into the software, when you open up a table, hopefully some of these coloured markings will already be there. So if you recognise that there is a huge fish at a certain table, you can join that table immediately. Whereas if you see that there are a number of regulars on that table, it may not be such a good table to join. Whereas if you don't have these markings, you won't necessarily know if you open any random table whether it's a good table or a bad table. There are certain things you can look for. For example, a lot of the regulars will bind for 100 big blinds and then they will enable auto rebuy, so they're continually topping up their stack. So if you see someone on the table with 70 big blinds, 80 big blinds, there's a good chance they don't have auto rebuy on, and there's also a good chance these players are fish. So if you can get a seat in position on one of these players, there's a good chance that you have found a good seat, but you don't necessarily know for certain whether that player's a fish. It's just slightly more likely. Whereas if you have coloured markings on these players, and also you've taken perhaps some notes about any memorable hands against these players, you can identify the fish a lot faster. There is 2 software you can use to help you identify the good tables. For example, there is one piece of software called Table Scan Turbo, which allows you to very quickly scan the tables. And one useful thing it does is it can connect to your Holder Manager database, so it can a lot more effectively report which tables have the fish on, because it has access to any stats you've collected on them, such as their VPIP and PFR. It can also help you to avoid tables with short stacks. It also takes into account whether a certain player is multi-tabling, so you can avoid tables with multi-tablers on. Perhaps it's more likely that a multi-tabler is going to be irregular, etc. So you can use the software however you want to find the best tables. Then there is also another piece of software called Table Scanner, which you can launch from within Holder Manager, and presumably it does a very similar thing. There are other resources as well for helping with table selection. Some of them are a little bit borderline in terms of ethics, so I'm not going to tell you that you definitely should use these. I'm just pointing out that it is an option. Sites like PokerTableRatings.com allow you to look up the results for a player on a certain site and basically see how much they've been winning at various stakes, and hopefully from this you can deduce whether they are a strong player. Not everyone is completely happy with the ethics of such sites, however. For example, PokerStars recently disallowed Poker Table Ratings from publishing the results of any of their players as a result of it basically being breach of privacy, breach of Data Protection Act really. Most other sites Poker Table Ratings will still work for, so if you are okay with using these resources, they are out there. So if someone's on your table and you're not quite sure whether they are a fish or whether they're regular, perhaps they made a certain play which could either be a very bad play or a very good play, then have a look at Poker Table Ratings. If you make an account, you can have 10 free searches every day. So have a look at some of the players on your tables and try and work out if they are fish or whether they are regulars. I did mention before, if you find yourself on a bad table, sometimes your best option is just to leave the table. And some of you may think, well, leaving the table, that's just being a bit of a coward really. You should just sit there and play if someone is putting you in some tricky situations. But this is not really the case. Leaving a table and selecting a better table is simply a logical way to attain the maximum win rate. If your goal is just to have fun and to play against some stronger opponents, then fine, stay at that table and have some fun. If your goal is to attain the maximum win rate, then it's just a purely logical decision to play against the weaker players at your particular limit. That brings us on to the final microstakes leak of this series. That is microstakes leak number 1, Tilt. Let's start by defining tilt. And this is the definition: anything that causes you to stop playing your A game, even if very subtle. Other players will give different definitions to tilt. For example, they'll say tilt is when you shove all in every hand, or tilt is when you smash up your house or you smash your computer. But these aren't really tilt, these are just manifestations of tilt. A lot of players, they get angry, but they won't necessarily start shoving all in every hand. They won't smash things. What they may find is that they loosen up ever so slightly, or they start being aggressive, perhaps they even tighten up, or they start folding in situations where they should be calling because they are scared of a bad beat or a cooler. And these are all manifestations of tilt. Tilt itself is just anything that causes you to stop playing your A game, even if you are subtle. Some of the things that can trigger tilt are as follows. Firstly, bad beats. This is really a type of anger related tilt or injustice related tilt. You feel that you should have really been entitled to the money in the middle of the pot. Perhaps you got all in with 95% equity and your opponent hits his 2-outer on the river, and you feel like you've been treated unfairly, and perhaps you even feel angry as a result, or you start convincing yourself that it's all rigged. And this can manifest itself in various ways. As I said, perhaps you start shoving all in every hand, or perhaps you just don't quite play your A game, perhaps you drop to your C game as a result of this particular trigger, bad beats. Along the same kind of line, running bad, so not necessarily getting bad beat, perhaps you just haven't been dealt a good starting hand for the last 100 hands, or perhaps you're just not flopping anything. And this can result in the same kind of feelings, maybe anger, injustice, and can manifest itself in the same kind of ways. Here's another type of tilt that players don't necessarily think about, and that's fear. Especially if you're playing against players or at limits where you don't necessarily feel as comfortable. Perhaps you've just moved up stakes and you really desperately want to run good, and what you may not realise is you're actually slightly fearful of going on a big downswing at that limit, much more as opposed to how you'd feel at your normal limit. Again, this can have similar manifestations. Maybe you start tightening up because you don't want to run into any bad beats or cooler situations, so you stop playing your normal game and you start only playing premium hands, whereas your game at the lower limit, which you normally play, you might be quite aggressive. Lack of motivation, especially if some of the other things have been affecting you, such as bad beats or running bad, you may not feel motivated to play so much, or perhaps you've just been playing a lot recently and you feel a little bit burned out. One thing this can result in is maybe not concentrating on the game as much as you might otherwise, which again is a form of tilt. Tilt doesn't just involve anger related situations. As I said, it's anything that causes you to stop playing your A game, so this includes lack of concentration. Perhaps you're doing things like browsing forums in another window, which can affect your concentration and you not play your A game. Confidence problems, especially if you've been running bad or taking bad beats. You may not feel that you can necessarily beat a certain limit, even though in the past you've comfortably beat that limit. Again, this can maybe result in you becoming fearful, and again manifest itself in ways such as you playing a lot tighter than you should, or folding in situations where you should be getting the chips in. Tiredness, again, can cause lack of concentration, just like lack of motivation, and stop you from playing your A game. And basically any distractions, perhaps there are people talking in the same room, or perhaps you are trying to do something in another window, like reply to a forum post or watch a film. Or perhaps there are things that happened earlier in the day and you are still thinking about these things rather than concentrating 100% on the action. So these are the things that trigger tilt. Manifestations of tilt include smashing things, shoving all in every hand, but also just lack of concentration, being a little bit tighter than you should, playing a little bit looser than you should maybe. But tilt itself, anything that causes you to not play your best game. So we're going to look very briefly at some of the solutions. You shouldn't necessarily expect to solve any of your tilt problems overnight, but the basic premise behind fixing your tilt problems is going to be this, and that's to think logically, not emotionally. For example, if we take the situation where we are getting bad beat, Emotionally, it feels unfair when we get bad beat. We get the money in with the best hand and we end up losing. So on an emotional level, it makes us angry and perhaps as a result we become tilted. If we think logically about the situation though, just because we got the money in as a 95% favourite, that doesn't mean we're guaranteed to win the pot. It only means we win the pot 95% of the time in the long run. So we have to lose that pot some of the time. In fact, if we never lost when we were a 95% favourite, it would be unfair in the other direction. It would be unfair to our opponent, who is entitled to win that particular pot 5% of the time in the long run. We also know that the nature of variance says that sometimes we can take a lot of bad beats in a concentrated period of time. So we may have a large number of bad beats in a 500 hand sample, for example, but it's not necessarily going to continue this way in the long run. It's just the random nature of variance and how sometimes we seem to observe streakiness or patterns in variance when in fact there are none, and over the long run it's all going to even out. So it's by thinking logically about the various triggers of tilt, not emotionally, that allows us to deal with them and not really be affected by them so much. And for each of the triggers there's a logical response and an emotional response, and we want to take the logical response in each case. Make sure you take regular breaks, and not only if you start feeling tilted, but you should also take regular breaks anyway to stay refreshed. The human mind can only concentrate for so long before it deteriorates to a lower state of concentration, and you can spend more time playing your best game if you take regular breaks. You can use breaks as a way to help you deal with tilt. It's not necessarily a long-term solution to dealing with tilt, but until you've completely solved your tilt problems, it can be a useful way of not letting your tilt affect your win rate at the tables by simply not playing if you feel tilted. In terms of dealing with the distractions we mentioned, the solution is very simple. Close Skype, close web browsers, don't watch a movie, etc. during your session, because it's going to result in you not playing your A game. Many people don't think as chatting on Skype while you are playing a session as tilt, but in many ways it is completely the same as tilt, because it's stopping you from playing your A game. It's causing you to become distracted and not to have your full concentration on the game, just as if you were distracted by something else like tiredness. It's going to have the same effect in the long run. So try to always focus 100% on your sessions when you're playing. Drinking water is also very important. You want to stay hydrated, otherwise you simply cannot think as clearly. The water in your blood determines how thick or thin your blood is. If you haven't drunk a lot of water, your blood is going to be a lot thicker, and basically your heart is going to have to work a lot harder to get all that blood around your body. It's going to result in you feeling tired if you are dehydrated. It's going to result in you not being able to think quite as clearly. So you may think, well, it's only water. Actually, staying hydrated can have a big effect on your ability to play your A game. In terms of motivational issues we mentioned, one thing you can do is review your goals and set some goals if you don't actually have any goals. Think about what you want to achieve in the short term as well as the long term. You don't just want to think, well, in 6 months I want to be in Las Vegas playing the 50, 100 games. It is a goal, but it's not really a realistic goal in terms of the short term. So you want to set some short term goals which you can attain. And usually it's very useful if these goals are not necessarily monetary goals, because you aren't necessarily in control of the type of variance you're going to run into in the short term. So if your goal is, I want to build my bankroll up to X amount, that's an okay goal, but a better goal would be, I want to review this amount of hands every day, or I want to put this amount of volume in and play my A game, or I want to play on these days and avoid tilt, whatever happens. These are better goals because you are in full control over whether you achieve these goals, whereas if you are setting monetary goals, you're not necessarily in control completely, because variance may kick in and you may find yourself losing money. And finally, if you are struggling with tilt problems still, there are books out there that you can read. For example, there is The Poker Mindset, which is a good book, and a much newer book entitled The Mental Game of Poker. Both of these are very good books to read. And of course, you can watch training videos as well. In fact, there are a number of psychologically orientated training videos here on PokerVIP.com, so check those out. I think there may be articles on tilt also. And even if the training video you are watching is not specifically to do with solving tilt problems or to do with the psychology of the game, it still can be useful to watch how some of the professional players play and the kind of thought processes they go through and how they respond to bad beats. A lot of the time you'll see coaches at the table in training videos, they take a bad beat and they don't even necessarily respond to that beat. They just are happy that they got the money in a good situation and not even remotely affected. It doesn't affect how they're going to play the rest of their session just because they took a bad beat. So even if the video doesn't directly deal with psychological issues, you can still learn a lot from watching other players play and thinking about what kind of mindset that they have. So this completes our 10 microstakes league series. Just to recap on the leaks we've looked at: microstakes leak number 10, calling too much; microstakes leak number 9, missing value; number 8, playing out of position; number 7, bad hands, big bluffs; number 6, c-betting without a plan; number 5, dead money; number 4, leveling, in particular leveling yourself; number 3, ignoring resources; number 2, table selection; and microstakes leak number 1, tilt. I hope this has been a useful series in helping you to maybe spot some of your own leaks at the microstakes. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.